everyone. Thank you for joining CivilNet. Our guest today is Araxie Vann. Araxie has been a presenter, a journalist at Voice of America for over 30 years. And today tables have turned and I get to interview you, pick your brain. Thank you for coming to CivilNet. This is very exciting.
Thank you for inviting me.
30 years in Voice of America, you've seen so much change in broadcasting altogether, in history, in events. Could you tell us more about it? You started in 1980 when Armenia was Soviet Armenia. You've seen Armenia's independence, you've probably broadcasted that. What were the highlights, your favorite news?
I started after finishing college in Boston area. I was looking for an interesting occupation, and Voice of America has always been in my mind because, as you know, as I grew up in Armenia and I left Armenia when I was 18, so I knew how important Voice of America's broadcasts were at that time because my parents listened to Voice of America. So it was always in the back of my mind to try and see if I can use my skills there, and it just happened that they were looking for young people at the time.
And the Armenian service was not probably a large one?
When I started there, Armenian service was about 10, 13 people. And it was radio then, and I had a lot to learn because I finished college. My major was economics major and Russian language, and this was a new area for me, but I quickly learned from the more experienced people there, and they were very, very smart and well-educated people there who knew Armenian very well, surprisingly. Most of them were not even from Armenia, although there were some from Armenia who left Armenia a long time ago after World War II. They were prisoners, and they were, after being in Europe, they went to America.
So there was a group of certain people with certain experiences, and I wanted to ask you, especially you, that you left Armenia, and back in the day communication with the Soviet Union wasn't exactly an easy task. What did you feel when you were broadcasting something and thinking everyone back home, Armenia, friends or relatives you might have left behind are hearing you, and yet you don't get to hear them back?
Well, that aspect was different, the fact that I talked to them and I never heard whether they liked it or not, and there was no way of knowing it either. But when I was preparing my material, writing stories for radio, I had or translating it from English into Armenian, and Eastern Armenian was the requirement there. I was always thinking, what would my friends think about this? How should I say something so that they understand? So in that aspect, it helped me growing up in Armenia and knowing Eastern Armenian and understanding how people think a little bit.
Yes.
So that helped me.
And how about with the choice of subject matter? Did you think, oh, this wouldn't be of interest, or this is particularly interesting? I'm sure people in Armenia...
Oh, definitely, because the choice was a lot. As you know, Voice of America was international radio broadcasting agency with 44 languages, and they're all over the world. The interest was different. Each country, each target audience had different interests. So Armenia's interest would be completely different from China's audience.
Naturally.
So we had a lot of material to choose from according to the area specific, and I always chose information pertaining to Soviet Union.
I have my personal memories with Voice of America because my grandmother was a big fan. And I remember she would always go to her room to listen, and like with the background noise coming and the signal not being very well, I actually remember going to sleep a couple of times to the Voice of America broadcast. Now that you come back years later and people still remember the Voice of America broadcasts, what reactions do they get when they meet you? What questions do they usually have?
Well, the reactions were even more interesting right after the fall of the Soviet Union, because I didn't visit Armenia before that. But when I visited first time after the fall of the Soviet Union, I couldn't believe the reaction. They knew my name. They have not seen me because I had, it was radio. They had not seen me, but they knew my voice. They could recognize me by my voice sometimes. So it was really interesting. And the interesting conversation I had once at a gathering, I was sitting across from the table from a man who was staring at me a lot, and later he started talking about that his job during the Soviet years, he worked at the radio, I think, and his job was to make jam the programs, Armenian language programs.
Jam the frequencies
the frequencies so that it was not audible. So I couldn't believe that I'm meeting the person who.
That's an interesting confession, and he recognized you.
Yeah, of course, so there were different times after.
Yes, speaking of different times changed. You were in broadcasting when the earthquake in Armenia happened, and you definitely have a story, and I'd like to hear it personally from you.
Yeah, I remember that day very vividly. It was just another day going to work when it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. In the radio, they announced that there's been an earthquake in Georgia, and I thought, oh, that must be close to Armenia. That's close to Armenia. And then by the time I went to work, they corrected. They said it's in Armenia, actually. So that was a very, very sad time, because not only Voice of America was broadcasting about it, but all the local TV stations, and we were seeing scenes from the earthquake, people. But very quickly, people started to react, non-Armenians and Armenians. Everybody started to help however they could. And the church, the Armenian church in Washington, both churches were doing their part to help. And the priest called me once, the St. Mary's Armenian Church priest called me, and Father Kalajian, and he asked me if I would have an interview with him during which he would tell when the plane load of help is arriving in Armenia, in the airport, because although they had, at that time they organized so that a plane load of help will go to Armenia, but they had no means of communication with Armenia. They couldn't even call and reach. And he had understanding with the Catholicos at the time to come and accept help, but he couldn't communicate. He couldn't
get the message through as to what time the plane will be landing.
He said, in the interview, I will give the exact time and place and time when the assistant, hoping that Catholicos will listen and he will be in the airport. So we did that, and later on he thanked me. He said, Catholicos said, I heard about over during the interview, and that's how he knew that to be there and accept the assistance.
And have there been instances where you felt proud announcing a certain news, like Armenia's independence? I often wonder about this moment.
Yeah, I have to say I'm very fortunate to be there when the government, the new Armenian government was forming, and for the first time there were going to be free elections in Armenia, and knowing how it's done in America, how the media covers the election, I immediately thought this will be a good opportunity to interview the candidates that were running for president at the time. And, I I had a very good opportunity to do that, and I'm happy about that.
And I also briefly read an interesting incident with Baber Harikian when he was a political prisoner and he was put out of Soviet Armenia.
Yes, that was also very interesting because, as you know, he was the Soviet more Moscow regime pursued him. They didn't like his activity. In any way, everybody knows his story, but he was basically
exiled to
exiled to Ethiopia, and he said, this is what he told me later, that they probably thought that he will not find anybody Armenian in Ethiopia, but he found the Armenian church there, and who helped him somehow to get in touch with Voice of America. And when I was working there, it was at the end of the day, most people have gone home, and I heard that he wants to be interviewed, he wants to talk. And I immediately said, of course, and we did the interview. And it was heard in Armenia after that interview that he is in Ethiopia after being exiled. And that's how people found out.
This is a question I often ask myself, because as a media agency, you have the also power, let's say, to distribute news, and you have you can be selective. A lot of the times people approach you with certain requests, and then it's up to you or the agency to decide if this gets broadcast or we should support this or not. In your experience, have there been instances when you thought the service has been abused or misused, or the information wasn't correct?
Well, everybody who works there knows and should know the journalistic code the Voice of America has. Its mission is to give news, whether people like it or not, the news, and not objective news, unbiased. And so you follow those principles. At the same time, the mission is to fill that gap of information. At the time when there was Soviet Union, obviously there were no other sources of free information, or very few. So our mission was to fill that gap, and whatever topic that appeared to us that will serve that mission was acceptable, of course, we chose.
And which agencies or news outlets do you follow now to receive news from Armenia or about Armenians? Did you have favorites?
Well, the basic rule at Voice of America is that you have to check the sources very thoroughly, and it has to be, the common rule is 3 sources have to say the same thing, basically. And nowadays there's so many media outlets in America, but we choose more credible ones. We go with Reuters, Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, credible, reputable newspapers, and even those we have to check always.
And what about Armenian sources?
Also Armenian sources. The same rule applies. If not just one source, several sources, always check to make sure.
A more general question, and probably a little bit more philosophical, like radio as means of, a lot of people say it's dying out. It has certainly is not as popular as it used to be. Well, how do you see the future of radio broadcasting?
Well, at the time we transitioned to TV, it was 2004. The word at Voice of America was that radio is dying, TV is more, has wider audiences. I didn't believe in it thoroughly because radio, people listen to radio all the time. But at the same time, I knew from my experience that everybody in Armenia watches TV. And to reach more audiences, TV gives more
a wider angle, yes.
Yeah, possibility for more people to. And that was not just my feeling. It was according to the statistics. Showed that TV has more audience than radio, although radio has
its own charm.
Its own charm, yes. And I liked radio
because my impression is that sometimes you're oversaturated with visuals and information.
Exactly,
sometimes it's nice to just filters at least the visuals out in certain
and
cases.
Also in TV you have, it's really different from radio. You have less time to give the most important, and radio you can talk more detail about things, but TV is limited because you have to have supporting video for it.
And what would you have done differently? I know it's a learning process, and I probably a lot of things changed as you continued working and gaining experience. What would you have done differently had you gone back to being a broadcaster now?
Maybe traveled more back and forth to Armenia, but as you know, it's so far, and when you work, you are not able to travel a lot, and because that connection with the people, your audience, is very important, and that's the hardest part, to prepare programs for that audience without being really with them all the time.
And now your daughter is living in Armenia, and you have a permanent connection with Armenia, re-established connection with Armenia. How does that make you feel?
Well, that makes me feel great that she is interested in my motherland, and it's hers too. And I feel that her generation is very different from mine, and I feel that she has a lot more in common with her people of her age than I probably do, because now with the social media and internet, there are no borders anymore. You know, they understand each other much better than years ago in my time.
All right, thank you very much. It was a pleasure learning from you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewer for joining us. I hope you found it as interesting as I did.